In the years leading up to the Allied invasion of Western Europe, German military planners placed immense faith in their fortifications. Across France, Belgium, and the German frontier itself, they constructed an elaborate system of bunkers, pillboxes, and strongpoints that they believed could halt or at least delay any Allied assault. These positions, many part of the Westwall, what the Allies would later call the Siegfried Line, were built with reinforced concrete, interlocking fields of fire, and underground shelters capable of withstanding heavy small arms fire and even some aerial bombardment. The Atlantic Wall, stretching along the coast of France, mirrored this doctrine of fortification. German engineers, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the Todt organization, reinforced beaches with concrete casements, artillery batteries, and machine gun nests. The intent was clear: slow the Allies at the waterline, force them into predictable killing zones, and buy time for counterattacks by mobile reserves. German commanders believed that these defenses, combined with the Wehrmacht's discipline, would frustrate Allied advances and force a stalemate. What the Germans did not anticipate was the scale of American field artillery, and more specifically, the devastating role of the 105mm M2A1 howitzer. Introduced before the war, but perfected through combat experience, this weapon became the backbone of American divisional artillery. Each infantry division was equipped with 3 battalions of 12 howitzers, giving American commanders a powerful and flexible tool. Unlike naval gunfire, which was often imprecise against hardened positions, the 105mm offered sustained barrages, coordinated fire missions, and the ability to adapt quickly to infantry needs. The weapon's characteristics made it uniquely suited to reducing German bunkers. Its 33-pound high-explosive shell, fired at ranges up to 12,000 yards, delivered concussive force capable of collapsing entrances, cracking reinforced concrete, and suppressing defenders inside. Moreover, its rate of fire, up to 8 rounds per minute in short bursts, meant U.S. batteries could saturate a target area in minutes. By 1943, as the Allies pushed into Italy, reports from both American and German units highlighted the increasing dominance of artillery on the battlefield. German diaries captured during the Salerno campaign noted the terrifying precision of American fire missions. U.S. after-action reports emphasized the ability of massed 105mm barrages to silence enemy strongpoints that had resisted infantry attacks. What emerged was a growing recognition: artillery, not infantry alone, would be the key to breaking fortified lines. This reality was reinforced by doctrine. The U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had long preached the principle of massed fires, concentrated on decisive points. By 1944, this doctrine was fully realized in combat. Forward observers, often embedded with frontline infantry companies, directed fire with radios and field telephones. The result was a responsive, integrated system where infantry could call down barrages within minutes. Against bunkers designed to resist frontal assaults, this flexibility proved lethal. For the Germans, the problem was twofold. First, their fortifications had been designed with an eye toward repelling infantry and absorbing aerial bombardment, but not for sustained, concentrated field artillery fire. Second, the rapid Allied advance and overwhelming American industrial output meant that U.S. artillery could not only deliver accurate fire, but sustain it indefinitely. Ammunition shortages plagued the Wehrmacht by 1944, while American units fired tens of thousands of shells in single operations. Thus, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, 2 contrasting visions of warfare clashed. On one side stood the German reliance on static defense, reinforced by engineering in concrete. On the other stood the U.S. commitment to mobility and firepower, embodied in the massed batteries of 105mm howitzers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both doctrines and reveal that even the strongest bunker line could not withstand the thunder of American artillery. In the chapters that follow, we will trace this evolution from the first tests in Italy to the decisive campaigns in Normandy, the hedgerows, and the Siegfried Line itself. Through combat reports, captured German diaries, and post-war analyses, a clear pattern emerges. Wherever German troops sought refuge in their bunkers, the 105mm howitzer followed and reduced their confidence, their fortifications, and ultimately their ability to resist. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer, later redesignated the M101A1, was more than just a piece of artillery. It was the backbone of American divisional firepower in the Second World War. To understand why German troops consistently underestimated its effectiveness, one must first look closely at its design, its employment in battle, and the industrial might that placed tens of thousands of these guns into the hands of American gunners across multiple theaters of war. At its core, the M2A1 was a medium-field howitzer, firing a 105mm or 4.13-inch shell weighing approximately 33 pounds. The gun's maximum range of over 12,000 yards allowed it to strike targets deep behind enemy lines, while its relatively light carriage and split trail enabled mobility in rough terrain. Unlike heavier weapons such as the 155mm long tom, the 105mm struck a balance, powerful enough to destroy fortified positions, but light enough to be moved quickly by truck, half-track, or even manhandled into position by its crew of 8. The standard high-explosive HE round was the most commonly used. Its impact fuse detonated with devastating effect against bunkers, trenches, and infantry concentrations. In addition, smoke rounds provided concealment or target marking, while white phosphorus shells served both as a psychological weapon and as an effective means of flushing out dug-in defenders. Armor-piercing shells, though less frequently employed, gave American gunners a measure of defense against German armor if pressed into direct fire roles. Crew drills were rehearsed endlessly. Each section functioned with precision. The gunner aimed using panoramic sights. The assistant gunner operated the breech, while loaders and ammunition handlers kept shells moving from limbers to the firing platform. Under combat conditions, a well-trained crew could deliver 3 to 4 sustained rounds per minute and as many as 8 in a rapid-fire burst. This rate of fire, multiplied across batteries and battalions, created the kind of saturation barrages that could overwhelm even the most disciplined defenders. Training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, ensured standardization. There, officers and enlisted men learned the doctrine of massed fires, concentrating artillery on decisive points rather than scattering shells across a wide front. Forward observers became vital links in this system, using radios and field telephones to call for fire on enemy strongpoints. When applied against bunkers, this doctrine produced devastating effects. A single forward observer could direct multiple battalions to pour fire on a grid square until the target was neutralized. American industry ensured that the weapon was never in short supply. According to U.S. Ordnance Department records, over 8,500 105mm howitzers were produced during the war, and millions of rounds of ammunition accompanied them. Unlike the German army, which faced mounting shortages of artillery shells by 1944, American units routinely fired thousands of rounds in preparatory barrages, sometimes expending more in a day than German batteries could in a week. This abundance of firepower changed the rhythm of battle. German bunker designers had not fully accounted for this. Their reinforced concrete positions were built to resist occasional heavy-caliber naval or aerial bombardment, but not the sustained pounding of hundreds of high-explosive shells directed with precision over hours or days. As U.S. Army after-action reports later confirmed, the concussive effect of repeated 105mm impacts cracked walls, destroyed embrasures, and collapsed entrances. Even when bunkers survived structurally, their defenders were often deafened, shaken, and psychologically broken by the ceaseless explosions. Captured German documents and post-war interrogations confirm this impression. One officer of the 352nd Infantry Division, defending near St. Lo, remarked that, "The Americans have artillery like we have never seen. It never stops. The men in bunkers cannot rest, cannot hear orders, cannot even think." Such testimonies underscore the profound mismatch between German expectations of static defense and the reality of American artillery doctrine. By the time Allied forces prepared for the Normandy landings, the 105mm had already proven its worth in North Africa and Italy. It was no longer just a supporting weapon, but a central instrument of destruction. German troops trained to hold fast in their concrete fortresses would soon discover that what seemed impregnable on the drawing board could be reduced to rubble under a storm of American shells. The M2A1 was not simply a weapon of war, it was the hammer that shattered the myth of unbreakable bunkers. The baptism of the 105mm howitzer in the European theater came not on the beaches of Normandy, but on the rugged coasts and mountains of Italy. When U.S. forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, they faced a determined German defense intent on throwing them back into the sea. The battle quickly turned into a test of wills. Could mobile American artillery break through fortified German strongpoints, or would the Wehrmacht's experience and defensive doctrine prevail? At Salerno, the terrain complicated everything. The beaches gave way to narrow valleys and high ground ideally suited to defense. German units of the 16th Panzer Division and 29th Panzer Grenadier Division deployed machine guns, mortars, and 88mm guns from well-prepared positions overlooking the landing zones. Early in the battle, American infantry units found themselves pinned by fire from bunkers and stone farmhouses converted into strongpoints. Here, the 105mm howitzers of divisional artillery came into their own. Firing from makeshift gun pits hastily dug near the beachhead, the howitzer batteries laid down continuous barrages against suspected German positions. After-action reports from the U.S. Fifth Army noted that artillery accounted for over 70% of the defensive fire during the first week of the landings. When counterattacking German tanks and infantry threatened to overwhelm thin American lines, coordinated fire missions blanketed entire approach routes, forcing attackers to ground or into retreat. The psychological effect on German infantry was profound. Their doctrine emphasized quick counterattacks, but under such fire, coordination became nearly impossible. From Salerno onward, the 105mm became a trusted ally of the American riflemen. Infantry platoons learned to rely on rapid calls for fire to deal with enemy bunkers that resisted small arms fire and grenades. Forward observers, sometimes perched precariously in church towers or hilltops, directed fire with deadly accuracy. One observer from the 36th Infantry Division recalled that the howitzers answered faster than we could reload our rifles. If a machine gun opened up, we had a barrage on it within minutes. The campaign for Monte Cassino in early 1944 tested artillery like no other battle in Italy. The ancient monastery atop the mountain dominated the surrounding valleys, and German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division turned the surrounding town and hillsides into a fortress. Bunkers were blasted into rock, reinforced with steel and timber, and linked by tunnels. The Germans believed these defenses would prove impervious to conventional attack. American units committed to the assault quickly discovered otherwise. The M105mm howitzers of multiple divisions were massed to support the infantry's advance. Fire missions targeted not just obvious bunkers, but also suspected tunnel entrances and communication routes. German accounts later admitted that the constant shelling made life underground nearly unbearable. One paratrooper wrote in his diary, "We are entombed by the American artillery. Even the rock shakes as if alive." The barrages were not enough to break Cassino quickly. The battle dragged on for months, involving New Zealand, Indian, Polish, and British forces as well. But they demonstrated that sustained 105mm fire could neutralize even the most formidable strongpoints. In the end, it was a combination of artillery, air bombardment, and infantry assault that finally forced the Germans to yield Cassino. Still, American gunners left with a critical lesson. No bunker, however strong, could withstand endless firepower.
To higher command noted heavy casualties, not from direct hits alone, but from concussion, debris, and the constant strain of living under shell fire. Soldiers rotated more frequently, morale sagged, and the aura of the impregnable fortress began to erode. By the time the Allies broke through the Gustav Line and advanced toward Rome in June 1944, both sides had drawn their conclusions. The U.S. Army was convinced of the central role of the 105mm howitzer in breaking fortified defenses. The German command, meanwhile, understood that even their most elaborate bunker lines would be subjected to levels of artillery fire they had not anticipated. The stage was now set for the clash of doctrines on a much greater scale: the landings in Normandy and the fight against the Atlantic Wall. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German High Command placed its faith in the Atlantic Wall. Stretching across the coast of Western Europe, the defensive system combined bunkers, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and concrete gun emplacements designed to withstand naval gunfire. German troops believed that these fortifications, coupled with the natural difficulties of amphibious assault, would render any invasion too costly to sustain. What they had not fully reckoned with was the destructive potential of the U.S. Army's field artillery once a foothold was secured. Naval bombardment opened the battle, but ships' guns were often too imprecise to destroy deeply entrenched bunkers. German defenders at Omaha and Utah beaches, particularly those of the 352nd Infantry Division, emerged from their positions largely intact once the barrage lifted. The task of reducing these fortifications fell to infantry supported by mobile artillery. Within hours of the first wave's landing, U.S. engineers and artillerymen worked furiously to bring 105mm howitzers ashore. By nightfall on June 6th, several battalions had established firing positions inland, their pieces dragged across sand, mud, and hedgerows under sporadic fire. Once deployed, the howitzers immediately began targeting German strongpoints that had resisted direct assault. At Omaha Beach, the 1st Infantry Division called in fire missions against pillboxes whose machine guns had pinned down rifle companies. Forward observers, often under fire themselves, radioed coordinates back to batteries positioned less than 2 miles from the shoreline. The resulting barrages were short, violent, and precise. After-action reports from the 16th Infantry Regiment noted that enemy fire slackened noticeably after these missions, allowing infantry to advance and clear the positions with grenades and flamethrowers. At Utah Beach, the situation evolved differently, but with the same conclusion. German defenses, manned by elements of the 709th Division, offered stubborn resistance from concrete casemates. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery brought its 105mm howitzers into action by the afternoon of June 6th, laying down smoke and high explosive shells to blind and suppress bunkers. Survivors of the defending units later described the barrages as endless hammer blows that cracked walls and filled air vents with choking smoke. Even those not killed outright were shaken into disorganization. By June 7th, with the beachheads linked, U.S. artillery expanded its role. Hedgerow country lay beyond the beaches, and the Germans quickly adapted by establishing interlocking defenses among the bocage. Here, the flexibility of the 105mm system shone. Batteries shifted positions daily, moving along narrow farm lanes to keep pace with advancing infantry. German commanders, expecting the Atlantic Wall to delay the Allies for weeks, now faced the reality of rapid Allied artillery deployment that eroded the defensive advantage of bunkers almost overnight. Captured German reports reflect the shock. A Wehrmacht officer of the 352nd Infantry Division recorded in his diary, later seized by American intelligence, "The American artillery is unrelenting. The bunkers, which we believed would hold indefinitely, are reduced to rubble one by one. The men cannot endure this fire. Even when the walls stand, their will is broken." Such testimony mirrors the findings of post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviews, which concluded that sustained howitzer barrages had far greater effect on morale than on material destruction alone. The Atlantic Wall, though formidable on paper, had been built to resist short, sharp engagements. It was never designed for days of continuous concentrated bombardment by thousands of artillery pieces working in coordination with infantry and air power. Once the Allies secured their guns ashore, the German concept of static defense began to unravel. The Normandy landings thus demonstrated the first large-scale confrontation between the U.S. 105mm howitzer and German fortress doctrine in Western Europe. Within a week of D-Day, German commanders no longer believed their bunkers could guarantee security. Instead, they came to dread the slow, methodical process by which American artillery reduced their defenses, one pillbox at a time, one hedgerow at a time, until nothing remained but shattered concrete and exhausted survivors. What began on the beaches was only the beginning. The true test would come inland, in the labyrinth of hedgerows where German defenses again relied on concealed strongpoints. It was there, in the summer of 1944, that the U.S. Army perfected the integration of infantry and artillery against an enemy still clinging to the hope that bunkers could halt the tide. The hedgerows of Normandy presented the Allies with one of the most difficult landscapes of the war. Known locally as the bocage, these thick earth embankments, overgrown with centuries of trees and brush, formed a natural fortress across the French countryside. Each field became a miniature defensive zone, and German troops quickly transformed them into deadly strongpoints. Machine gun nests, mortar pits, and even small bunkers were dug into the hedgerows, with interlocking fire that caught advancing infantry in lethal crossfire. For the U.S. Army, it was a nightmare. Tanks couldn't see beyond the next hedge, infantry squads had to cross open gaps under fire, and every attack seemed to dissolve into confusion. Yet the Americans had one advantage that proved decisive: their artillery, particularly the 105mm howitzer. From the earliest days of the bocage fighting, U.S. units relied heavily on fire support to soften German defenses before each assault. Forward observers learned to adapt to the terrain,
Climbing into barns, church steeples, or even trees to spot enemy positions concealed in the hedgerows. Once identified, coordinates were transmitted back to battalions of 105s waiting in orchards and meadows behind the lines. Within minutes, a curtain of high-explosive shells blanketed the German positions. One after-action report from the 29th Infantry Division, engaged near St. Lo in July 1944, described how no advance could be attended without massed artillery fire to cut the enemy out of his hedgerows. The report noted that infantry attacks unsupported by fire suffered heavy casualties, while those preceded by concentrated barrages often succeeded in driving the enemy from their positions. The Germans fought fiercely. Paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and elements of the Panzer Lehr Division made full use of the hedgerows, mounting counterattacks as soon as American barrages lifted. But the Americans adapted again, developing rolling barrages where artillery fire advanced yard by yard ahead of the infantry. This coordination allowed riflemen to move behind a wall of explosions, reaching the hedgerow line before the defenders could recover. German testimonies captured after the battle reveal how demoralizing this tactic became. A soldier from the 352nd Infantry Division recalled, "The shelling was so close, so constant, we could not raise our heads. We were deafened and blinded. When the Americans came through the smoke, we had no strength left to resist." The fight for St. Lo in particular showcased the central role of the 105mm howitzer. Over 2 weeks of brutal combat, American artillery fired tens of thousands of rounds in support of the push. The town itself, reduced to rubble, became a symbol of the destructive power of artillery in confined terrain. German survivors described the barrages as worse than anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery was heavy but less precise. The abundance of American ammunition further tilted the balance. Where German batteries had to ration shells, U.S. artillerymen fired without hesitation. According to ordnance records, some battalions expended over 5,000 rounds in a single day during the St. Lo fighting. The logistical network behind the front kept the shells flowing, ensuring that whenever German defenders regrouped, another storm of steel and fire was ready to break them again. By late July, as Operation Cobra prepared to break the German lines west of St. Lo, the pattern was clear. Infantry and armor would not advance far without artillery, and artillery would not succeed without the steady eyes of forward observers directing their fire. The 105mm howitzer had become the indispensable weapon of the bocage. For German troops, the bocage was supposed to be a defensive ally. Instead, it became a trap.
Every hedgerow that promised cover also drew concentrated American fire. Every bunker dug into the embankment eventually attracted a barrage that shook its walls apart. As one captured German officer put it, "We thought the earth itself would protect us, but the Americans tore even the earth to pieces." The lessons of Normandy were clear. Against an enemy willing to mass firepower, no terrain and no fortification could offer lasting safety. The bocage, once seen as impenetrable, had been reduced field by field under the relentless thunder of the 105mm guns. The next test would come at the very gates of Germany itself, where the Siegfried Line awaited. By the autumn of 1944, the Allies stood at the western border of Germany. Beyond lay the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall, a dense system of bunkers, dragon's teeth, pillboxes, and reinforced shelters stretching hundreds of miles. For Hitler's commanders, this was the ultimate barrier, the line that would blunt Allied momentum and buy time for a counteroffensive. For American troops, it was the first true test of whether artillery, particularly the 105mm howitzer, could dismantle fortifications deliberately built to withstand assault. The city of Aachen became the focal point of this struggle. Encircled by U.S. forces in October 1944, it was defended by a mixture of regular Wehrmacht, Volksgrenadiers, and remnants of the 116th Panzer Division. Surrounding the city and its approaches were dozens of concrete bunkers connected by trenches and minefields. Infantry attacks alone could not dislodge the defenders. Each position was stubbornly held, and German commanders believed the Siegfried Line's fortifications would bleed the Allies white. American artillery planners thought otherwise. Divisional artillery, reinforced with corps-level assets, concentrated fire against individual strongpoints. The 105mm howitzers were critical. Their mobility allowed them to be brought close to the front, sometimes within direct fire range of bunkers. Crews lowered their trails, sighted through open sights rather than panoramic scopes, and fired shells at near point-blank distance. At these ranges, high-explosive rounds struck with brutal effect, cracking embrasures and forcing defenders to abandon positions. After-action reports from the 30th Infantry Division describe such tactics in detail. In one instance, a platoon was pinned by a machine gun nest embedded in a reinforced concrete bunker. A forward observer called in a battery of 105s, which shifted from indirect to direct in 30 minutes. After several salvos, the bunker was silenced. Survivors inside later told interrogators that they had been deafened and disoriented, unable to return effective fire. The intensity of the shelling also revealed the psychological impact of artillery on static defenders. Captured German diaries near Aachen described sleepless nights under continuous bombardment. One soldier wrote, "The earth shakes without pause. The walls tremble. We are safe from bullets, but not from the thunder that never stops." Post-war interrogations confirmed that morale inside the Siegfried Line collapsed far faster than German planners expected. The weight of American logistics made the difference. American divisions could sustain fire missions day after day, with ammunition stockpiles carried forward by truck convoys across rebuilt French roads. In contrast, German artillery units in the West Wall rationed shells, often unable to respond with more than harassing fire. The disparity was stark. While American battalions might fire 10,000 rounds in a single preparatory bombardment, German batteries could scarcely manage a fraction of that over an entire week.
The battles around Aachen demonstrated another adaptation: combined arms. Infantry, tanks, engineers, and artillery worked in unison to reduce bunkers. Engineers would mark targets with smoke, forward observers called in concentrated barrages, and tanks advanced once defenders were shaken. In many cases, 105mm barrages suppressed defenders long enough for engineers to approach with satchel charges or flamethrowers. The collapse of Aachen in October 1944 shocked the German command. Not only had the first German city fallen to the Allies, but the supposedly impregnable Siegfried Line had been breached by sustained artillery and coordinated infantry assaults. Reports from German Corps headquarters noted with alarm that the Americans sacrifice no men where their guns can do the work. The implications were dire. The Siegfried Line, once thought an immovable barrier, had proven vulnerable to the very weapon that had defined U.S. divisional firepower since North Africa. For the Americans, Aachen validated their doctrine. Firepower, not frontal human wave assaults, would carry them into Germany. For the Germans, it was a grim reminder that even the strongest walls could be broken by relentless barrages. As winter approached, both armies prepared for the next phase. The Germans would soon launch their last great offensive in the Ardennes. Once again, artillery, above all the 105mm howitzers, would play a central role in deciding whether the line held or shattered under fire. In December 1944, the German army launched its final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes counteroffensive, remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. Caught by surprise, American units fell back or were surrounded, and the small Belgian town of Bastogne became a focal point of the struggle. Encircled by German forces, the 101st Airborne Division and supporting units held the town under freezing conditions, short of supplies and cut off from reinforcements. What kept them alive was artillery, particularly the 105mm howitzer. Within the Bastogne perimeter, several battalions of 105s, including the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery and the 321st Glider Field Artillery, established firing positions despite snow, ice, and constant German shelling. Forward observers reported targets from every sector, and the guns responded day and night. Ammunition was limited, yet every round was made to count. Fire missions disrupted German assembly areas, broke up infantry attacks, and even repelled armored thrusts by forcing tank crews to button up and lose coordination. Eyewitnesses from the 101st Airborne recalled how the steady thunder of the guns reassured exhausted riflemen. One paratrooper later wrote, "When the shelling began, we knew the Krauts wouldn't be coming through." German accounts confirmed the effect. Assault units approaching Bastogne described their attacks dissolving under unceasing shell fire. When the skies cleared on December 23rd, Allied aircraft finally resupplied the town, but it was the constant presence of artillery that allowed Bastogne to hold long enough for Patton's Third Army to break the siege. The 105mm had once again proven indispensable, not merely as a weapon of destruction, but as the backbone of American defense. Bastogne stood, and with it, the German offensive began to falter. By early 1945, the German dream of a defensive wall holding back the Allies had collapsed. The Siegfried Line lay fractured, Aachen had fallen, and the Ardennes gamble had bled the Wehrmacht of its last offensive strength. What remained of Germany's bunker defenses now stood in the path of a relentless Allied advance. For American troops and their ever-present 105mm howitzers, the mission was clear: drive into the heart of Germany, destroy resistance, and end the war. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 epitomized this new phase. Operation Plunder, launched by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group with U.S. 9th Army participation, demonstrated the overwhelming power of Allied fire support. American artillery units, including dozens of 105mm battalions, fired some of the most massive barrages of the European War. Reports from the U.S. 9th Army recorded over 1 million shells expended in preparation for the crossings. German bunkers along the East Bank were systematically targeted. Many were obliterated outright, while others were left untenable by concussion and debris. Survivors often abandoned their posts before the first Allied infantry touched the far shore. The Ruhr pocket soon followed, where German forces attempted to make a stand within the industrial heart of the Reich. Once again, fortified positions, factory complexes, and improvised strongpoints became targets for 105mm fire. American artillery doctrine, perfected in Normandy and the Siegfried battles, reached its fullest expression. Forward observers saturated enemy positions with precision fire, while rolling barrages paved the way for infantry advances. Prisoner interrogations conducted by Allied translator and interpreter section, ATIS teams, revealed a consistent theme. German defenders no longer trusted their bunkers. The psychological toll of artillery, more than physical destruction, convinced many to surrender rather than endure prolonged bombardment.
Post-war analysis reinforced these impressions. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that artillery, especially the 105mm howitzer, was among the most decisive factors in breaking German resistance in the West. German engineers, questioned in 1946, acknowledged that their fortifications had been designed for an earlier era of war. They were built to withstand naval bombardments like those of the First World War or sporadic shell fire, not the coordinated industrial-scale artillery campaigns unleashed by the U.S. Army. By May 1945, as American units linked up with Soviet forces on the Elbe, the fate of the bunker had been sealed. Concrete, steel, and machine guns could not overcome the weight of logistics, firepower, and doctrine that characterized U.S. artillery. The 105mm howitzer had shattered the myth of the impregnable fortress, demonstrating that no line of static defenses could stop a modern, mobile army supported by massed indirect fire. For the German soldier who once trusted in the thick walls of a pillbox, the lesson was bitter. The bunkers that promised safety had instead become tombs under the unending rain of shells. For the American infantrymen, the steady bark of the 105mm remained the sound of survival, clearing the way through every hedgerow, town, and fortress until the war was won. Thus, as the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the verdict was clear. German troops had never expected that the thunder of American 105mm howitzers would reduce their strongest defenses to rubble. In doing so, the weapon secured not only battlefield victories, but also its place as one of the defining instruments of Allied success in Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen fields of Bastogne, and finally the banks of the Rhine, the story of the 105mm howitzer was inseparable from the story of the American advance in Europe. What began as a weapon designed for flexible support became the backbone of U.S. firepower, shaping battles and breaking defenses that once seemed unassailable. German troops who trusted in steel doors and reinforced concrete learned that massed artillery, delivered with precision, coordination, and overwhelming volume, could unmake even their strongest positions. The howitzer's role went beyond destruction. It gave American infantrymen confidence that they would not face the enemy alone. It reassured men in foxholes, bought time for paratroopers under siege, and opened the way for tanks across rivers and through cities. Every major operation from 1944 to 1945 bore the signature of its thunder. In the end, the German doctrine of static defense collapsed under the relentless rhythm of American guns. Bunkers became death traps, and resistance gave way to surrender. When the war closed in May 1945, the 105mm howitzer stood as a symbol of Allied superiority in both firepower and logistics, a reminder that victory often belongs not just to courage in combat, but to the weight of sustained, decisive fire.